Hi there. Tonight we journey back in time, not to a grand medieval castle or a valiant knight's quest, but to the dining tables of everyday folk. Imagine a chill wind whistling through a drafty hovel, the scent of wood smoke clinging to the air, and a pot simmering over the hearth. You're hungry, truly ravenous, after a long day tilling fields or toiling in the Lord's workshop. Your stomach growls, anticipation building for the evening meal. But as the lid comes off that pot, a whiff of something off drifts up. A sour tang, a faint, almost metallic note that your modern nose immediately recoils from. You see a hunk of meat, greyish and perhaps a little slimy, alongside some root vegetables that look suspiciously like they've seen better centuries. And you realize, with a sinking feeling, that if you actually ate this medieval feast, you probably wouldn't survive. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe. Turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're sitting there, in your imagined medieval hovel, eyeing that questionable meal. What was on the menu for most medieval people, especially the common folk? It wasn't the roasted swans and spiced wines you see in movies. Oh no, your typical medieval peasant's diet revolved heavily around grains. Think barley, oats, and rye, usually ground into flour for dark, dense bread or boiled into a thick porridge known as pottage. This pottage was often the cornerstone of every meal, a warm, if not particularly exciting, filler for rumbling bellies. It was cheap, relatively easy to grow, and could be stretched with whatever was available. Historians still argue whether the sheer monotony of this diet contributed more to medieval health issues than the obvious lack of hygiene. But either way, variety wasn't exactly the spice of life for most. And speaking of spices, they were practically non-existent for you, the commoner. Those fragrant treasures were for the wealthy, used to flaunt status and, as we'll get to, sometimes to hide a multitude of sins. For you, flavor came from whatever herbs you could forage, or perhaps a bit of salt if you were lucky. It's a far cry from your modern pantry, isn't it? No wonder people were often described as gaunt. They were getting calories, sure, but not necessarily the most nutritious kind. A quirky tidbit: some medieval medical texts actually suggested that too much raw fruit could cause fevers, which is wildly different from our 5-a-day mantra. So, you've got your pottage, probably a bit bland, and then there's that centerpiece, the meat. In your modern world, you pop to the supermarket, grab a neatly packaged cut, and trust that it's been handled hygienically. In the medieval era, that trust simply didn't exist, and for good reason. The concept of poorly preserved meats wasn't just a risk, it was a constant, looming threat. Imagine the butcher shop, or rather, the open-air stall. No gleaming stainless steel, no refrigerated display cases, just animal carcasses, often hanging in the elements, exposed to flies, dust, and whatever else the medieval wind carried. Now, they did have methods of preservation, rudimentary as they were. Salting was a big one. You'd pack meat heavily in salt, hoping to draw out moisture and inhibit bacterial growth. And it worked, to a degree. But this wasn't table salt from a shaker. It was often coarse, unrefined, and sometimes mixed with impurities. Then there was smoking. Picture sides of bacon or fish slowly curing over a smoldering fire. This also helped preserve food, adding a distinctive flavor that we still enjoy today. albeit from much more controlled environments. But here's the rub. These methods weren't foolproof. They didn't eliminate all bacteria, especially if the meat was already compromised before preservation began. And once you cut into that heavily salted or smoked joint, the clock started ticking again, even faster without refrigeration. You might carve off a piece for your dinner, and the outer layers would seem fine. But deeper inside, or in the nooks and crannies, spoilage could still be silently creeping. Historians still argue whether medieval people truly understood the direct link between microscopic organisms and illness, or if they simply knew that bad meat makes you sick. Either way, the consequences were felt acutely. A quirky tidbit: some medieval recipes actually suggested parboiling meat in vinegar or wine before salting, as if giving the bacteria a good bath before their final salty embrace. It probably didn't do much. You're trying to chew your way through a piece of this preserved meat now, and it's tough, intensely salty, and leaves a peculiar aftertaste. You might even notice a faint, metallic tint, or a sourness that your modern palate would immediately reject as off. But for your medieval self, this might just be Tuesday's dinner. The options were limited, and going hungry was a far more immediate and terrifying prospect than a stomachache a few hours later. The idea of expiration dates would have been utterly alien. Food was consumed when it was available, and often. It was consumed in a state that you, with your 21st century sensibilities, would firmly label as spoiled. It wasn't just about taste. It was about survival, a grim calculation that often meant risking illness over starvation. You've just taken a bite of that suspiciously preserved meat, and your internal alarm bells are screaming. But in the medieval world, those alarm bells were often muted by necessity or simply recalibrated by a lifetime of questionable culinary experiences. This brings us to the fascinating and frankly quite disturbing reality of rotten revelations and rituals. It wasn't always a case of accidental spoilage. Sometimes food was consumed in a state that we would unequivocally call rotten, yet it was accepted, or even, bizarrely, given an attempt at legitimacy. Without modern understanding of bacteria, people often attributed illness to bad humors or divine displeasure rather than the festering pathogens in their supper. So, if the meat looked a bit green, smelled a bit pungent, and felt a bit slimy, you didn't throw it out. Oh no, that was precious protein. Instead, you tried to make it more palatable. This is where those expensive spices, if you were lucky enough to be a noble, truly came into their own. A heavy dusting of cinnamon, cloves, or nutmeg could overpower the smell of decay. Think of it less as seasoning and more as an olfactory camouflage. It wouldn't kill the bacteria, of course, but it might make the experience of eating it slightly less gag-inducing. Historians still argue whether the primary purpose of medieval spices was flavor enhancement or spoilage concealment, but it was likely a potent mix of both. For the common folk, lacking such luxurious distractions, the ritual might simply be to boil it longer, hoping the heat would somehow purify the questionable bits. Or, perhaps, they just held their breath and swallowed quickly. There's a quirky tidbit about medieval butchers occasionally selling meat that was high, a polite term for well on its way to putrid at a discount. It was a known quantity, a trade-off. Save a few pennies, risk your gut. You can almost see the medieval version of a clearance sticker: slightly aromatic beef, ideal for stew, but not ideal for your digestive system. Imagine the dinner conversation: is this lamb moving? Just a little, deer adds character. This wasn't just about masking taste. It was about managing expectations. People knew food spoiled. They just didn't have the tools or the knowledge to prevent it consistently. So they developed a kind of tolerance, a grim acceptance that a meal might make you feel unwell afterwards. The alternative, starvation, was far worse. Your modern stomach churns at the thought, but for your medieval self, it was simply part of the daily gamble. Every meal was a roll of the dice, and often the dice were loaded against you. You've survived the slightly too aromatic lamb. Congratulations. Now, let's move to another culinary challenge of the medieval era, the peril of undercooked meats. Today, you understand the importance of cooking meat to a specific internal temperature to eliminate harmful bacteria like Salmonella or E. coli. But in the medieval kitchen, thermometers were centuries away, and doneness was a far more subjective and frankly dangerous concept. Imagine a grand feast, perhaps at a lord's castle, where an entire ox or a wild boar is being roasted over a massive open fire. It's a spectacular sight, a testament to wealth and culinary ambition. Flames lick at the skin, turning it a glorious golden brown, while rich fats drip and sizzle. The aroma is intoxicating, drawing everyone in. But here's the catch. Roasting such large animals whole, without the benefit of ovens or precise temperature control, often meant that while the exterior might be beautifully charred and crispy, the deeper sections, particularly near the bone, remained stubbornly undercooked. You can picture the scene, the cook, sweating profusely, turning the massive carcass with long poles. They'd eye the exterior, perhaps poke it with a knife, but there was no way to accurately gauge the internal temperature. And let's be honest, in the rush and chaos of feeding dozens, if not hundreds, of hungry mouths, a little pink in the middle might have been overlooked, or even considered desirable by some. Historians still argue whether medieval palates truly preferred rarer meats, or if it was simply a necessity born of primitive cooking methods. Either way, the consequences were often the same: food poisoning, stomach upsets, or worse, a quirky tidbit to ensure uniform cooking, or at least to try. Some medieval kitchens would spit roast smaller animals by stuffing them inside larger ones, like a primitive turducken. You might have a pig stuffed inside a cow, turning slowly over the flames, which sounds impressive, but probably led to a delightful mix of overcooked and still raw meat. You're trying to carve off a piece now, and the knife slips, revealing a stubbornly red, almost raw center. Your modern self recoils, but your medieval self, ever pragmatic, might just shrug and try to find a more thoroughly cooked bit. Or perhaps, if you were a guest at the Lord's table, you'd politely eat round it, not wanting to offend your host. It's a delicate balance, trying to enjoy the luxury without succumbing to the lurking dangers. This wasn't just about a slightly chewy bite. It was a gamble with your health, taken with every mouthful. So, you've navigated the perils of questionable meat, both preserved and undercooked. But what about the humble vegetables? You might think these would be a safe haven in the medieval diet, a crisp, clean counterpoint to the meaty risks. Think again. While they certainly offered different nutrients, medieval vegetables came with their own set of silent, unseen dangers. Compounded by prevailing beliefs and inadequate cooking methods, in your modern world, you're encouraged to eat plenty of fresh, raw vegetables, salad for health, your doctor might proclaim. But in the medieval era, a curious and somewhat understandable belief held sway. Many people thought raw vegetables were unhealthy and caused disease. the reasoning wasn't entirely baseless. Contaminated raw produce, especially if grown with animal manure or washed in unclean water, could indeed transmit parasites and bacteria. Without knowing why, they observed that eating raw produce sometimes led to sickness, so they drew a logical, if incomplete, conclusion. This meant that most vegetables, from cabbages to root vegetables, were routinely cooked, often for extended periods, in stews or pottages. The problem wasn't necessarily the cooking itself, but the methods of cooking. While boiling might kill some pathogens, the long, slow simmering in communal pots meant that if new, contaminated ingredients were added, or if the pot itself wasn't properly cleaned, it could become a breeding ground for bacteria. And sometimes, the cooking wasn't thorough enough to fully eliminate robust pathogens, especially if the heat wasn't consistent or the vegetables were merely warmed rather than properly boiled. Historians still argue whether this widespread aversion to raw vegetables was a learned behavior, based on unfortunate experiences or a philosophical medical belief stemming from ancient Greek humors. Either way, it shaped the medieval plate. A quirky tidbit: some medieval medical texts even suggested that certain windy vegetables like beans and cabbages could cause flatulence and therefore imbalance the body's humors, leading to illness. So, not only were they worried about the visible dangers, but also the invisible, philosophical ones. You're now faced with a bowl of stew, and the vegetables are soft, almost mushy, having surrendered their vibrant color and much of their texture to hours of simmering. You might wonder if any nutrients survived the ordeal. But beyond that, you can't help but think about the murky water they were washed in, or the unwashed hands that might have handled them before they ever reached the pot. It's a subtle anxiety, a whisper of what-ifs that hangs in the air, a constant reminder that even the simplest ingredients carried complex risks in a world without modern food safety standards. You've tried the meat, the mushy vegetables, and a rather flat, dense bread. You're starting to get a full sensory experience of medieval cuisine, and frankly, it's a bit unsettling. But beyond the visible and tangible risks, there was an unseen enemy, a silent, lurking danger that medieval people had no concept of: microbes. Today, you understand that bacteria, viruses, and other microorganisms are responsible for most foodborne illnesses. You wash your hands, disinfect your counters, and store food properly to keep these tiny villains at bay. In the medieval world, this knowledge simply didn't exist. Instead of microbes, the prevailing theory for disease was often miasma. Imagine the idea that bad air, rising from decaying matter, stagnant water, or even sick people, carried disease. So, if your meat smelled foul, it wasn't because of invisible bacteria multiplying on its surface. It was because of bad air emanating from it, or perhaps because your own humors were out of balance. This lack of understanding about the true culprits meant that preventative measures were, by modern standards, woefully inadequate or entirely misdirected. Washing hands thoroughly before preparing food, not a widespread practice. Cleaning surfaces with anything more than a damp cloth. Unlikely a mainstream historical fact. The germ theory of disease, which revolutionized medicine and food safety, wasn't widely accepted until the late 19th century, thanks to the pioneering work of scientists like Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch. That's centuries after your medieval dining experience. This means that for medieval people, the concept of food poisoning as we know it, a specific illness caused by specific pathogens ingested through contaminated food, was essentially a mystery. They knew they got sick after eating certain things, but the why was attributed to everything from witchcraft to divine punishment, a quirky tidbit. Some medieval physicians would sniff at a patient's excrement or urine, believing the smell could indicate imbalances in their humors, rather than the presence of bacterial infection. You're sitting there, contemplating this complete lack of germ theory, and it's a chilling thought. Every surface, every utensil, every unwashed hand was a potential vector for contamination. Historians still argue whether the high mortality rates in medieval times were more due to acute foodborne illnesses or chronic malnutrition and repeated exposure to low levels of pathogens. Either way, your digestive system was constantly under siege. You'd develop a certain resilience, perhaps, but at what cost? The unseen enemy was everywhere, silently waiting to turn your meager meal into a source of serious illness, or worse. And you, blissfully unaware of its microscopic nature, could do little but hope for the best. So, you're eating your medieval dinner, perhaps trying not to think about the invisible miasma, but there's another, very tangible issue staring you in the face: the complete lack of refrigeration. In your modern home, your fridge hums quietly, a magical box that keeps your milk fresh for weeks and your leftovers safe for days. In the medieval era, that hum was replaced by the constant nagging worry of food spoiling before you could eat it. This meant that food preservation was a challenge of epic proportions, defining daily life and diet. Imagine a hot summer day in a medieval village. The sun beats down, and any food left out quickly succumbs to the heat. There were no insulated coolers, no ice machines, certainly no fridges. Meat, once butchered, had to be consumed almost immediately or subjected to those imperfect preservation methods we discussed, like heavy salting or smoking. Fresh milk would sour within hours. Vegetables, unless stored in cool, dark cellars, would wilt and rot rapidly. This meant that most people lived a hand-to-mouth existence when it came to perishable goods. You couldn't just pop to the market once a week and stock up. Daily, or at best, every couple of days, trips were often necessary for anything fresh. This struggle with perishable food led to a greater reliance on staples that could last: grains, dried beans, hard cheeses, and cured meats. Even then, spoilage was a constant battle. A barrel of salted fish might still go rancid, or a sack of grain might become infested with weevils. It wasn't just about losing food. It was about losing valuable calories and protein that were hard-won and essential for survival. Historians still argue whether the lack of refrigeration pushed medieval diets more towards fermented foods like ale and wine, which we'll get to as a safer alternative to water, or if those habits developed independently. A quirky tidbit: some wealthier medieval households had ice houses, pits dug deep into the ground, insulated with straw, where ice and snow collected in winter could be stored for a short period into summer. But this was a luxury for the very few, and even then, it offered only limited, temporary cooling. You're now scraping the last bits of your meal, and you realize that every bite carried a silent countdown. There was no best buy date, no warning label, just the slow, inevitable creep of decay. This wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a fundamental limitation that shaped everything from daily routines to the very types of food available. The fight against spoilage was a never-ending one, a battle you, as a medieval person, waged daily, often without realizing the microscopic armies you were up against. So, you're trying to keep your food from spoiling, a monumental task in itself. But even if you somehow manage to get your hands on fresh ingredients, Another insidious threat loomed large in the medieval kitchen: cross-contamination, chaos. In your modern kitchen, you probably have separate cutting boards for meat and vegetables. You wash your hands frequently, and you wipe down surfaces with antibacterial spray. You understand that invisible germs can spread from one food to another, or from dirty hands to clean food. In the medieval era, such concepts were, well, foreign. Imagine a bustling medieval kitchen, whether it's a smoky, communal hearth in a village or a chaotic, professional kitchen in a lord's manor. There's often one rough wooden table for all. Preparation: the same knife might be used to butcher raw meat, chop vegetables, and then slice a piece of bread, all without a thorough cleaning in between. Water, if available for washing, might be shared among multiple tasks, becoming increasingly murky and contaminated as the day wore on. There were no dishwashers, no hot running water, and certainly no understanding of sanitizing surfaces. Poor hygiene was rampant. People worked long, arduous hours, often without access to proper washing facilities. Hands frequently soiled from working with animals, dirt, or other unsanitary materials would then handle food. Flies, rodents, and other pests drawn by the food scraps and lack of proper waste disposal were constant companions in any food preparation area, carrying their own share of pathogens. It's a miracle anyone survived a medieval feast, really. Historians still argue whether the prevalence of parasitic infections in medieval populations was more due to contaminated water or direct food contamination from poor hygiene. A quirky tidbit: some medieval medical texts actually suggested that washing your hands too much could dry out the skin and upset the body's natural balance, discouraging frequent hand washing. So, while a quick rinse might occur, a thorough scrubbing to eliminate germs was definitely not on the menu. You're watching a medieval cook at work now, and they just wiped their hands on their tunic after butchering a chicken, then immediately started kneading dough for bread. Your stomach does a little flip-flop. The concept of clean was more about visible dirt than invisible bacteria. The lack of awareness about the dangers of cross-contamination meant that even if one ingredient started out relatively safe, it could quickly become a vector for disease simply through shared surfaces and unwashed hands. It was an invisible enemy, silently spreading sickness from plate to plate, all under the noses of people who simply didn't know any better. Having considered the messy reality of medieval hygiene, let's now talk about something considered truly luxurious in the medieval world: spices. Today, you probably have a cupboard full of them: cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, pepper used freely to enhance the flavor of your food. In the medieval era, these exotic ingredients were incredibly expensive. Costing fortunes and traveling vast distances along perilous trade routes. So, why were they so highly prized? Beyond their delicious flavors and their status as a symbol of wealth, there was a darker, more pragmatic reason. They were often used for masking the malice of spoiled food. Imagine you're a wealthy noble, hosting a grand banquet. The meat you're serving, despite your best efforts at preservation, might still be a little past its prime. It could have a faint whiff or a slightly off-color appearance. You certainly don't want to serve something obviously rotten to your esteemed guests. That would be a huge social embarrassment, not to mention a health hazard. This is where spices became your secret weapon. A generous amount of pungent spices like black pepper, ginger, or cloves, combined with strong flavored sauces, could effectively overpower the taste and smell of decay. It's a rather grim thought, isn't it, that your expensive, Exotic spices weren't just for gourmet flavor, but also for olfactory camouflage. They wouldn't kill the bacteria that were causing the spoilage, of course. So, while your nose and taste buds might be tricked, your stomach would still be dealing with the consequences. Historians still argue whether this masking effect was the primary reason for the heavy use of spices in medieval cuisine, or if it was a happy, if unintended, side effect of their popularity. It was likely a bit of both. Status symbols that also served a very practical, if unpleasant, function. A quirky tidbit. Some medieval cooks believed that certain spices had medicinal properties that could counteract the ill effects of corrupted food. So, they weren't just masking the bad taste, they genuinely thought they were making it safer. You can picture it now, the master chef sprinkling an extra dash of cinnamon on a dubious-looking stew, muttering about its purifying qualities. It sounds comforting until you remember the bacteria still happily feasting within. The use of spices highlights a medieval pragmatism born of necessity. When food was precious and waste was not an option, every trick in the book was employed to make it palatable, even if it meant a gamble with your health. The irony is that the very ingredients that symbolized wealth and refinement also served as a testament to the ongoing battle against spoilage and disease. You've seen how spices were used to mask the dubious nature of meat. But let's turn to something universally beloved: sweetness. Today, your sugar bowl is probably full of refined white granules, a product of modern processing. In the medieval world, the primary sweetener was honey. It was precious, delicious, and for the most part, a wonderful natural product. But even this sweet nectar, this symbol of nature's bounty, harbored a silent threat: the potential for botulism, if not properly processed and stored. Botulism is caused by toxins produced by Clostridium botulinum bacteria. These bacteria thrive in anaerobic oxygen-free environments, and while rare in honey, if honey is unpasteurized or contains dormant spores, and then somehow creates an anaerobic environment, perhaps in a poorly sealed container, where some spores activate, it could become dangerous. For medieval people, of course, this was an unknown. They just knew that sometimes a batch of honey seemed fine, and other times it could make you terribly ill, or even kill you. Imagine yourself in a medieval kitchen, perhaps a humble cottage. You've got a small clay pot of honey, maybe from your own beehive or traded from a neighbor. There's no pasteurization process, no standardized bottling. The honey might contain pollen, beeswax, or even tiny bits of dust and debris. If it wasn't filtered properly, or if it was stored in an unsealed container where conditions allowed the spores to activate, it could become a deadly cocktail. It's a mainstream historical fact that infant botulism, specifically, is a risk with raw honey, and is why you're advised not to give it to babies under 1 year old even today. But for adults, the risk from honey is generally very low. However, in an era with less understanding of bacteria and food safety, any incidents, however rare, would have been mystifying and terrifying. A quirky tidbit: some medieval texts mention honey being used not just as a sweetener but also as a medicinal salve for wounds, due to its natural antibacterial properties when used topically, not ingested with active toxins. It's a testament to its dual nature, both healing and potentially harmful. You're drizzling some honey onto your bland pottage, savoring the rare sweetness. You don't know about spores or toxins. You just know that sometimes honey from certain sources or kept in a certain way could bring about a mysterious illness. Historians still argue whether medieval people consciously avoided certain batches of honey due to past negative experiences, or if outbreaks were simply accepted as an unfortunate, unpredictable occurrence, like a bad harvest. It's a reminder that even the simplest, most seemingly innocent foods in the medieval world carried hidden risks. A silent game of Russian roulette played with every meal. So, you've navigated the subtle dangers of honey, a truly universal medieval sweetener. Now, let's pivot from the hidden threats and return to the very foundation of medieval existence, particularly for the vast majority of the population, the peasant's plate. Forget those opulent feasts and exotic spices we sometimes discuss. Your daily reality as a medieval commoner was one defined by necessity, simplicity, and a diet that, while often sufficient for survival, certainly wasn't without its own set of dangers. Your staple diet, the bedrock of almost every meal, revolved around grains. Imagine waking up, and your first thought is probably about the bread you'll eat, or the pottage you'll scoop from the communal pot. These grains were overwhelmingly barley, oats, and rye. Wheat, while prized, was often reserved for the wealthier classes or for special occasions, so your bread would have been dark, dense, and coarse, a stark contrast to the fluffy white loaves you're used to. It was incredibly filling, providing the bulk of your calories, which were desperately needed for the grueling, physical labor of the day. But these grains weren't always pristine. Imagine the harvesting, threshing, and milling processes. There were no sealed silos, no modern pest control. Grain could easily be infested with weevils, mold, or other contaminants. Stored in damp conditions, it could develop toxins, like the dreaded ergot, which we'll discuss later, that caused terrifying illnesses. So, while bread was the staff of life, it could sometimes be a very wobbly staff indeed. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants truly understood the nutritional differences between various grains, or if their choices were purely driven by yield and availability. Alongside your grainy staples, you'd have vegetables, primarily root vegetables like carrots, parsnips, and turnips, along with cabbages and peas. These were often grown in your own small garden plot or foraged. As we've discussed, they were almost always cooked into thick stews or pottages, often to the point of mushiness, due to beliefs about raw foods and a lack of understanding of nutrient retention. Protein was a luxury. Occasional fish, usually salted or smoked to preserve it, might appear, especially if you lived near a coast or river, or during religious fasting days. Meat, real meat from larger animals, was a rarity for you. It might come from a scrawny pig you raised, or a communal hunt, or perhaps the tougher, less desirable cuts from a lord's butchering. A quirky tidbit: some monastic orders kept detailed records of their daily food consumption, revealing an astonishing reliance on beer or ale for calories, sometimes consuming several liters a day, even for children. This was often safer than water, but certainly not without its own risks. You're chewing your dark, gritty bread now, and while it fills your stomach, you can't help but notice the occasional fleck of something that isn't flour, or a strange, earthy taste. It's a diet of survival, designed to provide energy for a hard life, but constantly skirting the edges of nutritional deficiency and potential contamination. You've just experienced the rather humble and often precarious reality of the peasant's diet. Now, let's ascend the social ladder from your drafty hovel to the gilded halls of a medieval castle, and explore the diet of the elite, noble nibbles. You might assume that with wealth came safety, that access to more varied and expensive foods automatically meant a healthier, less dangerous diet. While it certainly offered more comfort and choice, even the tables of lords and ladies were not immune to the inherent risks of medieval food practices, often presenting their own unique and sometimes surprisingly fatal flavors. The wealthy could afford the freshest, most desirable meats. Imagine succulent roasts of beef, pork, and lamb. They had access to game, to venison, wild boar, fowl like swans and peacocks, often hunted from their own vast estates. These meats, when fresh, were a symbol of status and power. But as we discussed earlier, even large roasts cooked over open fires could hide dangerously undercooked centers, turning a feast into a potential food poisoning event. The sheer quantity of food prepared for a noble household also increased the risk. More food meant more handling, more opportunities for cross-contamination, and greater challenges in ensuring everything was cooked through, beyond the meats. Nobles could afford a much wider variety of other foods. Spices, as you now know, were a major part of their culinary arsenal, imported from distant lands at great cost. They weren't just for masking spoilage. They were used generously to create complex, highly seasoned dishes that reflected the host's wealth and sophistication. Sugar, another hugely expensive import, made its appearance in elaborate desserts and sweetened dishes, adding to the opulent, if not always healthy, spread. Historians still argue whether the noble diet, rich in meat and lacking in fiber, contributed to different kinds of ailments compared to the peasant diet, such as gout or constipation. A quirky tidbit: some medieval noble banquets featured dishes so elaborate they were more art than food, like roasted peacocks redressed in their feathers, or sateltes, edible sculptures that often looked like castles or mythical beasts. You're sitting at this imagined noble table, overwhelmed by the sheer abundance. Platters are piled high with roasted meats, glistening with rich sauces. Bowls of exotic fruits, if in season, and sweetened pastries beckon. But despite the lavish presentation, you notice the familiar, slightly off-putting aroma from that one dish, or the way a servant quickly whisks away a platter that looks a little too grey. The very elements that symbolized luxury, freshness, quantity, exotic spices also introduced specific vulnerabilities. The pursuit of lavishness sometimes overshadowed the fundamentals of food safety. So, while the peasant might face gradual illness from a monotonous, contaminated diet, the noble might face an acute, potentially fatal, crisis from a grand, but ultimately risky, meal. You've had a taste of both the humble peasant's fare and the extravagant noble's table, recognizing that danger lurked on both. Now, let's widen our gaze and consider how medieval eating habits and their associated risks changed depending on your location. This is about regional risks, a culinary map of danger. The medieval world was not a monolithic culinary landscape. Diets varied immensely across Europe, and even within regions, influenced by available resources, climate, and local customs. What was a staple in one area could be a luxury or entirely unknown in another. And with these variations came different sets of food safety challenges. Imagine yourself on the coast of Scandinavia. Here, your diet would heavily rely on fish, both fresh and, more commonly, dried or salted to survive the harsh winters. Stockfish, air-dried cod, was a crucial source of protein, but its preparation and storage methods, like those for other preserved meats, could still harbor bacteria or molds if not done meticulously. Move to the Mediterranean, and you'd find a greater emphasis on olive oil wine, fresh fruits, and vegetables that thrived in the warmer climate, while perhaps offering a more varied and arguably healthier overall diet. The heat also accelerated spoilage, putting greater pressure on quick consumption or effective drying methods in the colder, inland regions of northern Europe, such as what is now Germany or England. The reliance on root vegetables, grains, and cured meats was pronounced, similar to our peasant's plate. Forests provided game, but its freshness was always a concern, especially if transported over long distances. Dairy products like cheese were crucial, providing much-needed protein and fat. But cheese production methods varied widely, and improperly aged or contaminated cheese could lead to illness. Historians still argue whether certain regional food processing techniques, like specific types of fermentation, inadvertently provided better food safety than others. A quirky tidbit: in some parts of medieval Europe, particularly those with abundant rivers and lakes, beavers were considered fish for fasting days due to their aquatic lifestyle, and thus were permissible to eat even when meat was forbidden. You can picture it, a medieval cart, laden with goods, trudging across muddy roads. The journey itself added layers of risk. Food that started out relatively fresh could easily spoil en route. Each region developed its own ways of coping with spoilage and scarcity, often through trial and error. A pragmatic approach born of necessity rather than scientific understanding. So, whether you were feasting on dried fish in the north or fresh figs in the south, the shadow of potential foodborne illness was never far, a constant companion on your culinary map of medieval Europe. You've traversed the regional culinary map of medieval Europe, from fish-heavy Scandinavia to the grain belts of the north, and seen how geography shaped both diet and danger. But before any food even reached your plate, there was a fundamental element of life that, more often than not, was teeming with its own set of risks. Water. Today, you simply turn on a tap and expect clean, safe drinking water. In the medieval world, accessing potable water was a constant struggle, making water woes, from well to worse, a daily reality. Imagine your medieval village. Your primary sources of water would be rivers, streams, and wells. While some wells might have provided relatively clean groundwater, many were susceptible to contamination. Animal waste from nearby farms, human waste from rudimentary latrines, often simply pits or emptying directly into waterways, and general runoff from streets and unhygienic living conditions could easily seep into water sources. There was no concept of water treatment plants, no chlorination, no filtration systems beyond perhaps a simple cloth. So, when you dipped your bucket into the village well, or filled your jug from a nearby stream, you were often collecting a cocktail of unseen pathogens, bacteria like Vibrio cholerae causing cholera, or Salmonella typhi causing typhoid fever, as well as various parasites, could thrive in these contaminated waters. A mainstream historical fact is that waterborne diseases were a leading cause of death and illness throughout the medieval period, particularly in more densely populated areas and during outbreaks of epidemics. It was a constant, silent killer. A quirky tidbit: some medieval medical texts suggested that thick or heavy water was unhealthy, while light or thin water was better. This often correlated with stagnant versus flowing water, where flowing water, though not always clean, might at least have been less stagnant, and thus less likely to harbor certain pathogens. You're trying to quench your thirst now, lifting a ladle of water that looks cloudy and has a faint earthy smell. You drink it, and immediately you feel a slight uneasiness. It's a gamble with every sip. Historians still argue whether the widespread consumption of weak ale and wine was primarily due to its caloric value or a conscious choice to avoid potentially fatal water, though it was likely a combination of both. In a world where every drink could be a death sentence, the search for safer alternatives was paramount. You've just swallowed that questionable medieval water, and a shiver, perhaps of apprehension, runs through you. It's no wonder, then, that medieval people often turned to other beverages. This brings us to ale and wine. Safer sips, hidden horrors. While the idea of drinking fermented beverages all day might sound like a perpetual party, for medieval folk, particularly in Northern Europe, it was often a pragmatic choice born of necessity. And yes, sometimes it was safer than water, but certainly not without its own set of dangers. Ale, typically made from grains like barley and hops, was a ubiquitous drink, consumed by everyone from peasants to nobles, including children. Wine, while more common in southern Europe where grapes flourished, was also a significant part of the diet. The key reason these were often safer was the fermentation process. The alcohol content, even in weak ale, which was often very low, sometimes less than 1%, and the boiling of water during brewing, helped to kill many of the pathogens found in contaminated water. So, instead of a stomach full of cholera, you might just end up with a slight buzz, which in medieval times was probably a welcome distraction. This is a mainstream historical fact. Medieval populations often preferred ale and wine due to the perceived safety over untreated water sources. However, calling them safer is a relative term. There were still hidden horrors. Firstly, the alcohol content, even if low, could accumulate, leading to chronic alcoholism. Imagine drinking several liters of weak ale a day, every day, from childhood. Secondly, the brewing and winemaking processes weren't always perfect. Contamination could still occur from unclean vessels, poor hygiene during fermentation, or the addition of impure ingredients. Sometimes, unscrupulous brewers would add questionable substances to enhance flavor or appearance, leading to unexpected illnesses. Historians still argue whether medieval people understood the addictive nature of alcohol, or if daily consumption was simply seen as a natural part of sustenance. A quirky tidbit: some medieval medical texts suggested that very strong wine, when mixed with herbs, could be a remedy for certain ailments, or even used as an antiseptic for wounds. You're now offered a tankard of ale. It's thick, cloudy, and a little yeasty, nothing like the clear, crisp beers you're used to. You take a sip, and it's surprisingly filling, a bit sour, but also somehow comforting. It warms your belly and makes the day's drudgery seem a little less bleak. But then you recall stories of people getting the shakes or falling into a stupor after too many tankards, realizing that even this safer alternative came with its own set of risks: trading one form of illness for another, perhaps more insidious one. You've just considered the double-edged sword of medieval beverages, offering safety from waterborne pathogens while introducing other risks. Now, let's delve into another potential dietary pitfall that stemmed from foraging and a lack of precise botanical knowledge: the forgotten fungi, accidental toxins. Today, if you want mushrooms, you buy them cultivated and packaged from a reputable source. Or perhaps you go foraging with a knowledgeable guide and a comprehensive field guide. In the medieval world, wild mushrooms were a free, easily accessible food source, but also a silent game of Russian roulette. Imagine a medieval peasant scrounging for food in the local woods after a long day in the fields. Mushrooms, popping up after a rain, seemed like a gift from nature, a quick, effortless addition to a sparse meal. But differentiating between edible and highly poisonous fungi is a skill that takes years to master, and medieval people often learned through painful, sometimes fatal, trial and error. There were no detailed illustrated guides, no easy way to confirm identity. It was often based on local lore, passed down through generations, and sometimes that lore was incomplete or dangerously inaccurate. A mainstream historical fact is that deaths from mushroom poisoning, though likely underreported, were a grim reality in medieval times, particularly in regions where foraging was a common practice. Symptoms could range from severe gastrointestinal distress, the less deadly but still agonizing kind, to neurological damage, organ failure, and rapid death, depending on the type of toxin ingested. Some of these toxins are incredibly potent, even in small amounts. Historians still argue whether some unexplained mass poisonings or mysterious illnesses in historical records might have been attributed to accidental mushroom ingestion rather than other causes. A quirky tidbit: some medieval folklore believed that mushrooms were children of the devil or spawn of the fairies, reflecting a deep-seated suspicion and fear of their unpredictable nature, which was probably well-founded given the dangers. You're walking through the damp, leaf-strewn forest floor now, and you spot a cluster of fungi, their caps glistening in the dappled sunlight. They look enticing, perhaps a vibrant red or a delicate white. You remember your grandmother's advice: if it grows on wood, it's good. But then you recall a whispered story of a neighbor who ate some good-looking mushrooms and never woke up. The decision to pick them, to add them to your evening stew, becomes a moment of intense, silent deliberation. It's a stark reminder that in a world where food scarcity was a constant threat, even free food from nature could come with an incredibly steep and often lethal price. You've just avoided a fatal fungi faux pas, a testament to the daily gamble medieval people faced with nature's bounty. But the dangers weren't just found in the wild. They were often lurking right in the very tools and vessels used to prepare and serve food. This brings us to the insidious risk of lead linings and lethal lunches. Today, you trust your cookware to be food safe, made from stainless steel or non-toxic coatings. In the medieval era, lead was a common material, and its presence in kitchenware quietly poisoned countless individuals. Imagine a medieval kitchen, perhaps one of a wealthier household, as lead was often a component of more durable or decorative items. Lead was favored for its malleability and its ability to create a smooth, seemingly non-reactive surface. It was used to line storage containers for wine, or even to glaze pottery. Acidic foods and drinks, like wine, vinegar, or fruit juices, would leach lead from these containers. Once ingested, lead accumulates in the body, leading to chronic poisoning with devastating effects. A mainstream historical fact is that lead poisoning, or plumbism, was a significant health issue throughout history, and its presence in medieval cookware and plumbing, if present, contributed to various ailments. Symptoms included severe abdominal pain known as painter's colic, anemia, kidney damage, neurological problems leading to tremors, paralysis, and cognitive impairment, and even death. It was a slow, agonizing decline, often mistaken for other illnesses or simply attributed to fate. Historians still argue whether the widespread use of lead in medieval times inadvertently contributed to certain societal trends, like madness. Among the elite, a quirky tidbit: some medieval winemakers actually added lead acetate, known as sugar of lead, to wine to sweeten it and improve its clarity. This was particularly dangerous as it made the wine taste better, masking the very poison within. You're now at a noble's banquet, enjoying a glass of fine wine from a beautiful, glazed goblet. The wine is sweet, almost syrupy. You don't know that the glaze on the goblet, or perhaps even an additive in the wine itself, is slowly leaching a silent killer into your system. You might feel a dull ache in your stomach or a persistent fatigue, symptoms you'd dismiss as common medieval discomforts. The insidious nature of lead poisoning was its stealth. It didn't strike immediately like food poisoning, but slowly, relentlessly eroded health over months or years. A hidden danger in plain sight, making every meal a potential step towards a grim, lingering demise. You've just sipped from that potentially lead-laced goblet, a chilling thought. But of all the hidden dangers lurking in medieval food, perhaps one of the most terrifying and widespread came from a seemingly innocuous source, the very grain that formed the bedrock of many diets. This brings us to ergot, the holy fire's fiery grain. Ergot is a fungus, Claviceps purpurea, that grows on rye and other cereal grains, particularly in damp conditions. When consumed, it produces powerful alkaloids that can cause a horrific condition known as ergotism, or St. Anthony's fire. Imagine a cool, damp harvest season in a medieval village. The rye, a staple for countless peasants, is brought in, perhaps already a little moldy. Without modern agricultural practices or quality control, contaminated grains could easily make their way into the flour. When you baked your daily bread from this flour, you were unwittingly incorporating a deadly toxin. The effects of ergotism were truly horrifying, making it a mainstream historical fact that outbreaks caused widespread suffering and death. There were two main forms of ergotism. The gangrenous form caused blood vessels to constrict, leading to agonizing burning sensations, hence St. Anthony's fire, followed by the decay and eventual loss of limbs, which would turn black and fall off. Imagine the searing pain, the grotesque progression, and the utter despair. The convulsive form, on the other hand, attacked the nervous system, causing violent and painful spasms, tremors, hallucinations, and even psychosis. Victims would writhe in agony, convinced they were possessed, experiencing vivid and terrifying visions. Historians still argue whether some medieval instances of dancing plagues or mass hysteria were, in fact, undiagnosed outbreaks of convulsive ergotism, a quirky tidbit during the Middle Ages. Victims of St. Anthony's fire were often taken to hospices run by the monastic order of St. Anthony, where they sometimes recovered if they were fed a diet free of contaminated grain. The fact that moving them away from their local food source often helped, even if the reason wasn't understood, is fascinating. You're now biting into your coarse rye bread, and suddenly you feel a tingling sensation in your fingers, a strange burning in your extremities. A distant, unsettling feeling begins to creep into your mind, a sense of unreality. This wasn't just food poisoning. This was a living nightmare, a slow-acting poison that distorted reality and destroyed the body from within, all hidden within the most fundamental of medieval foodstuffs. You've just had a terrifying brush with ergot, perhaps experiencing the first insidious tingles of St. Anthony's fire from your rye bread. It's a stark reminder that in the medieval world, even the most basic foodstuffs could be lethal. But beyond accidental contamination and natural toxins, there was another layer of danger, born not of ignorance but of deliberate deception, food adulteration, cheaters, culinary crimes. Today, strict food safety regulations and consumer protection laws aim to prevent this, but in medieval times, the temptation to cut corners for profit often led to widespread and sometimes dangerous trickery. Imagine a bustling medieval market filled with vendors hawking their wares. While most people were honest, the opportunity for unscrupulous merchants to gain an advantage was immense. Diluting or substituting ingredients for profit was a common practice. Milk might be watered down, weakening its nutritional value. Bread, that essential staple, was particularly susceptible. Bakers might add cheaper, inferior grains to wheat flour, or even less savory ingredients like chalk, sawdust, or ground beans to increase volume and weight, stretching expensive flour further. This wasn't just about cheating customers out of their money. Some of these additives could be genuinely harmful, causing digestive upset or introducing toxins. Wine was another prime target. It might be watered down, colored with elderberries, or other plant dyes, or even fortified with questionable additives to mask poor quality or prolong its shelf life. Spices, being incredibly valuable, were often counterfeited. Cheaper, less flavorful powders might be mixed in, or entirely different. Less valuable plants might be substituted and sold as the real thing. This rampant adulteration meant that you, the medieval consumer, could never be entirely sure of the quality or even the true contents of what you were buying. Historians still argue whether medieval authorities were more concerned with the economic fraud of adulteration or its potential health consequences. A quirky tidbit: there are records of medieval ale tasters who would check the quality of ale by pouring some on a wooden bench and sitting on it in their leather breeches. If their breeches stuck to the bench after a certain amount of time, it meant the ale had enough sugar and thus, presumably, alcohol and quality. You're haggling with a miller for your week's supply of flour, watching him scoop it from a large sack. You feel the texture, note its color, but you have no way of knowing if it's pure rye or if it contains a generous portion of something else entirely. It's a constant battle of wits between the buyer and the seller, a daily risk that your food, which you painstakingly earned money for, might be a sham, or worse, a subtle poison. These were the culinary crimes of necessity and greed, adding another layer of treachery to the already dangerous medieval diet. You've just navigated the tricky terrain of medieval market fraud, where even your flour might be a dubious blend. But beyond the daily deceptions and constant struggles with spoilage, the rhythms of medieval life themselves imposed unique, and often dramatic, food-related risks. Feasts and famines, the rhythmic risks. Life in the Middle Ages was characterized by stark contrasts, oscillating between periods of relative abundance and devastating scarcity, and both extremes presented distinct dangers to your health. Imagine a bountiful harvest, a rare blessing. The granaries are full, the animals are plump, and there's a sense of relief and celebration. This leads to feasts, especially for the wealthy, but even peasants would experience temporary periods of greater access to food. At these times, the danger often shifted from scarcity to overconsumption and the acute risks we've discussed poorly. Cooked meats, contaminated dishes prepared in haste for large gatherings, and the sheer volume of food, which could overwhelm a digestive system accustomed to more meager fare. A mainstream historical fact is that sudden shifts in diet, especially from a low-calorie, monotonous diet to one rich in meat and fats, could cause severe digestive distress, sometimes leading to illness or even death, particularly in those already weakened by chronic malnutrition. That, then, inevitably, came the lean times. Bad weather, crop failures, wars, or plagues could quickly tip the balance into famine. This was the ultimate dietary disaster, a period of horrifying scarcity that tested human endurance to its limits. During famines, people would eat anything. They could get their hands on tree bark, roots, weeds, diseased animals, or even, in desperation, leather or other inedible materials. The dangers here are obvious: severe malnutrition, starvation, and the consumption of highly toxic or unsanitary items out of sheer desperation. These periods led to widespread death and immense suffering. Historians still argue whether the long-term effects of chronic malnutrition during lean years made populations more susceptible to subsequent outbreaks of plague or other diseases. A quirky tidbit: during particularly severe famines, there are records of desperate people resorting to cannibalism, a truly horrific last resort that underscores the extreme pressures faced during these periods. You're living through one of these cycles now. One season, you might be at a village feast, indulging in a slightly tough but plentiful piece of communal meat, feeling full for the first time in weeks. The next, you might be foraging in a barren field, your stomach gnawing with hunger, knowing that every leaf you consider putting in your mouth could be poisonous, but feeling compelled to try anyway. The medieval diet was not a steady state, but a perilous dance. Between potential poisoning from abundance and slow starvation from lack, each rhythm carrying its own unique and often devastating risk. You've just endured the stark realities of medieval feasts and famines, a brutal reminder of how precarious life was. And with these fluctuating dietary conditions, it's hardly surprising that medieval people experienced a constant companion: digestive distress, the common complaint. Today, you might pop an antacid for heartburn or take a probiotic for gut health. In the medieval world, chronic stomach ailments, bouts of diarrhea, constipation, and general malaise were simply an accepted part of life, often seen as normal, rather than symptoms of underlying issues. Imagine yourself frequently experiencing a dull ache in your stomach, or sudden cramps that send you scurrying to the nearest privy. This wasn't an occasional occurrence. For many, it was a near-daily reality. The reasons are now clear to you: a diet heavy in coarse, unprocessed grains, poorly cooked or spoiled meats, contaminated water, lack of variety, and the constant exposure to various pathogens from unhygienic practices. Your digestive system, robust as it might be, was under constant siege. A mainstream historical fact is that historical records, including medical texts and personal accounts, frequently mention symptoms consistent with food poisoning, dysentery, parasitic infections, and chronic indigestion among the general population. While they didn't have the scientific terminology, they certainly had the experience. These issues weren't just uncomfortable. They weakened the body, making individuals more susceptible to other diseases and reducing their overall life expectancy. Historians still argue whether the average medieval lifespan was more significantly shortened by acute diseases like the plague, or by the cumulative effect of chronic illnesses stemming from diet and poor sanitation. A quirky tidbit: medieval physicians, operating under the theory of humours, often prescribed strange remedies for digestive issues, like purging the bowels with potent herbs or applying warm poultices to the stomach to balance internal temperatures. You're feeling that familiar gurgle in your stomach right now, a dull, persistent discomfort. You might try some herbal tea, or simply try to ignore it and continue with your arduous day. It's a constant, low-level battle your body is fighting, a silent testament to the daily assaults it faces from your diet, this wasn't just about feeling a bit unwell. It was about living with a body that was perpetually fighting off unseen invaders, its energy diverted from vitality to constant internal defense. You've grown accustomed to the constant grumbling of your medieval stomach. When these digestive troubles, or any other illness, became too much to bear, medieval people, much like yourself today, sought relief. But their remedies were vastly different, often veering into the realm of herbal cures, from remedy to ruin. Today, you might consult a doctor or pop a scientifically formulated pill. In the medieval era, medicine was a blend of folklore, superstition, and empirical observation, relying heavily on plants, and sometimes the cure was just as dangerous as the disease. Imagine a village healer, or perhaps a monastic infirmarian, examining you. They don't understand germ theory or precise dosages. Their knowledge comes from ancient texts, passed down traditions, and trial and error. The primary tools in their arsenal were herbs. Many herbs did, and still do, possess genuine medicinal properties. Willow bark, for instance, contained salicylates, a precursor to aspirin, and was used for pain relief. Chamomile was used for digestion. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval herbalism laid some of the foundational knowledge for later pharmacology, despite its limitations. However, the problem arose when these herbal concoctions were misused, misidentified, or contained highly toxic plants. Without standardized measurements, a dosage that was therapeutic in one instance could be lethal in another. Some powerful plants, like foxglove, digitalis sauce, or hemlock, could be easily confused with benign herbs by the untrained eye, leading to accidental poisoning. And then there were the more exotic remedies, like powdered animal parts or even lead, given as internal medicines. You might remember that crocodile dung sunscreen from earlier. Perhaps not, that was a joke, but it illustrates the range of rather dubious medical practices. A quirky tidbit: some medieval medical practices involved purging the body through induced vomiting or excessive bleeding, believing it would rid the body of bad humors, often weakening the patient further. You're being offered a steaming cup of herbal tea for your stomachache. It smells strongly of something earthy and bitter. You drink it, hoping for relief, but knowing in the back of your mind that last time, old Maud's concoction for a cough made her violently ill. Historians still argue whether the cumulative effect of these sometimes toxic remedies contributed significantly to medieval mortality rates, or if the sheer resilience of the human body generally overcame them. It was a terrifying gamble. Trying to find a cure could lead you further down the path to ruin. A desperate attempt at healing in a world with limited scientific understanding. You've braved the dubious herbal remedies, recognizing that medieval healing was a risky business. Now, let's consider a force that, perhaps surprisingly, played a significant, if indirect, role in shaping the medieval diet and its associated dangers: the role of religion in regulation. Today, your dietary choices are largely personal, perhaps influenced by health trends or ethical considerations. In the medieval Christian world, the Church held immense power, and its pronouncements on fasting and feasting deeply impacted what, when, and how people ate, sometimes inadvertently affecting food safety. Imagine your life as a medieval Christian. The calendar was punctuated by numerous fast days and seasons, far more extensive than modern Lent. During Lent, Advent, and every Friday, for example, the consumption of meat, eggs, and dairy was forbidden. This meant a significant portion of the year required a pivot to fish, vegetables, and grains. For many, especially the poor, this wasn't a huge shift, as meat was already a luxury. But it did increase reliance on preserved fish, which, as we've discussed, came with its own set of spoilage risks, if not properly prepared. It also meant a higher intake of plant-based foods, which, given the issues with contaminated water and inadequate cooking, could lead to different forms of illness. Mainstream. Historical fact is that the extensive fasting regulations of the medieval church significantly influenced agricultural practices and food preservation techniques, driving the demand for non-meat protein sources like salted cod and dried legumes. The flip side of fasting was feasting. After long periods of abstinence, the opportunity to eat rich, varied foods was eagerly seized. However, as we discussed with feasts and famines, a sudden indulgence after a period of restrictive eating could itself cause digestive upset or, in the case of poorly prepared celebratory meals, acute food poisoning. A quirky tidbit: some medieval popes issued specific rulings on what constituted fish for fasting purposes, sometimes including aquatic mammals like beavers and otters, or even puffins, leading to rather unusual dietary interpretations. You're navigating a Lenten fast now, your body craving the fat and protein of meat. You're eating more dried fish, more watery pottage, and you can feel the effects of a less varied diet. Historians still argue whether the Church's dietary regulations, despite their spiritual intent, inadvertently led to widespread nutritional deficiencies or specific types of foodborne illnesses by concentrating consumption on fewer, potentially riskier food types. It was a spiritual dictate with very real, and sometimes hazardous, culinary consequences. You've just navigated the dietary demands of medieval religious observance, revealing how even spiritual rules could shape the dangers on your plate. Now, let's go even further back in the food chain, right to the source of much of the medieval diet, the act of slaughtering and preparing animals. This brings us to butchery practices, blade and bacterial bloom. Today, meat processing plants operate under stringent health codes, with sterile environments and rapid chilling. In the medieval era, it was a far more rustic and, frankly, unhygienic affair, often creating perfect conditions for bacteria to thrive. Imagine the scene in a medieval village or town. Butchering was often done locally, either by a designated butcher in an open-air stall or even within a household. An animal would be slaughtered, often without proper stunning, and then quickly butchered. There were no designated clean rooms, no sterile tools. The same knives, often dulled and unwashed, would be used repeatedly. Blood, entrails, and waste products would often accumulate around the butchering area, attracting flies, vermin, and acting as a breeding ground for bacteria. A mainstream historical fact is that the lack of refrigeration and poor sanitation during medieval butchering meant that contamination of meat with fecal matter and environmental bacteria was almost inevitable. The surface of the meat, once exposed to the air and such conditions, would quickly become colonized by microbes. This increased the risk of pathogens like Salmonella, E. coli, and Clostridium perfringens contaminating the meat before it even reached the cookpot. And remember, medieval people had no concept of these microscopic threats. A quirky tidbit: some medieval butchers would inflate the carcasses of animals by blowing air into them to make them appear larger and more impressive, a practice that obviously introduced more air and whatever was in the butcher's breath into the meat. You're watching a butcher now, his hands red with blood, flies buzzing around the hanging carcasses. He uses a cloth to wipe his knife, then resumes cutting. Your modern sensibilities are screaming, but for your medieval self, this is just how it's done. Historians still argue whether medieval people understood the concept of diseased meat and consciously avoided it, or if economic necessity often forced them to consume even visibly unwell animals. This was a direct pipeline from a less than high environment straight to your dinner plate, a constant source of bacterial bloom that silently threatened every meat-based meal. You've just peered into the rather unsanitary world of medieval butchery, understanding how disease could be quite literally cut into your meat. Now, let's leave the butcher's stalls and step out onto the bustling, noisy streets of a medieval town where convenience met danger in the form of street food scandals, quick bites, quicker illness. Today, you might grab a hot dog from a street cart or a kebab from a vendor, trusting in health inspections and hygiene standards. In the medieval era, street food was readily available, affordable, and often a perilous gamble. Imagine the sights and sounds: hawkers shouting, the sizzle of meat over small braziers, the smell of baking pies. For many medieval town dwellers, especially those without a proper kitchen or too busy to cook, street vendors offered a tempting solution for a quick meal. You could buy hot pies filled with meat, sausages on sticks, roasted fowl, or small loaves of bread. This was the fast food of the Middle Ages, appealing because it was hot, theoretically killing germs. Convenient and relatively cheap. However, the conditions under which this food was prepared and sold were often appalling. Vendors would operate directly on the street, exposed to dust, animal waste, and the general filth of medieval urban environments. Ingredients might be of questionable origin, often lower quality cuts of meat or leftovers from previous days. The food, once cooked, would sit out for extended periods, cooling down to temperatures perfect for bacterial growth. There was no concept of food temperature zones or safe holding times. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval city records often contain complaints about uneven regulations against unsanitary street food practices, indicating a recognition of the problem even if the cause wasn't understood. A quirky tidbit: some medieval street vendors would cleverly disguise the type of meat in their pies, sometimes using cat or dog meat instead of more expensive options, making a mystery meat pie literally a mystery. You're walking past a vendor now, eyeing a steaming meat pie. The crust looks golden, and the aroma is inviting. You think about your empty stomach and the effort it would take to cook something at home. You buy it, taking a bite. It's warm, savory, and fills you up. But a few hours later, that familiar medieval stomach discomfort starts to set in. Historians still argue whether medieval street food was a major vector for widespread epidemics, or if it primarily caused localized individual bouts of sickness. Either way, these quick bites were often a shortcut not just to satiety, but also to a quicker illness, turning convenience into a dangerous culinary lottery. You've braved the dubious delights of medieval street food, a true test of your digestive fortitude, given all the hazards we've uncovered from putrid meat to lead-laced winu. Might wonder if medieval people ever tried to make things safer. And indeed, they did, albeit with limited success compared to today. This brings us to preservation innovations, a glimmer of hope. While far from modern standards, there were early, albeit limited, attempts at safer food preservation that offered a nascent understanding of extending food's shelf life. Imagine a world where every meal was a race against decay. Necessity truly was the mother of invention. Medieval people relied heavily on methods that, while imperfect, did manage to slow down spoilage. We've talked about salting and smoking meat and fish, These were refined over centuries, with people learning through experience what levels of salt or smoke were most effective. Drying, especially for fruits, vegetables, and fish, was another crucial method, relying on sun and wind to remove moisture and inhibit microbial growth. While not perfect, a properly dried apple or piece of fish was far less likely to cause immediate illness than a rotting fresh equivalent. mainstream historical fact is that the development and refinement of these basic preservation techniques were critical to the survival of medieval populations, allowing for the storage of food over winter months or during times of scarcity. Without them, famine would have been even more catastrophic. Another rudimentary form of preservation was fermentation, which, as we discussed with ale and wine, transformed perishable goods into more stable forms. Pickling, using vinegar or brine, was also employed for vegetables, creating an acidic environment that deterred many spoilage bacteria. A quirky tidbit: some medieval cooks experimented with coating fruits in wax or honey to create a protective barrier against air and insects, a kind of primitive food wrapping. You're observing a family meticulously salting fish, layering it in barrels, hoping it will last through the winter. They might not understand the microbiology, but they know that if done correctly, it saves lives. Historians still argue whether the cumulative knowledge of effective preservation techniques was shared widely through medieval society, or if it remained largely localized and empirical, passed down within families or guilds. These innovations, while modest by modern standards, represented humanity's earliest attempts to gain some control over the perishable nature of food, offering a crucial, if flickering, glimmer of hope against the constant threat of spoilage and hunger. You've seen the glimmer of hope in medieval preservation techniques, but even with those advancements, some members of medieval society remained acutely vulnerable to the dangers of the diet: children. This brings us to childhood concoctions, risky rations for the young. Today, infant formula is rigorously tested, baby food is meticulously pureed and packaged, and pediatric nutrition is a specialized field. In the medieval era, young children, with their developing immune systems and unique nutritional needs, often received rations that were not only nutritionally inadequate, but also dangerously unhygienic. Imagine a medieval baby or toddler. Breastfeeding was common and generally safest for infants, but weaning was often a perilous transition. When mothers could no longer breastfeed, or when children grew older, they would transition to diluted versions of adult food. This often meant gruels or thin porridges made from coarse grains, softened with water or weak ale. These watery concoctions lacked sufficient nutrients for growing bodies and could easily become contaminated. Without proper sterilization of feeding vessels, often simple wooden bowls or rags used as rudimentary bottles, bacteria could proliferate rapidly. A mainstream historical fact is that childhood mortality rates in the medieval period were as high, with a significant portion of children not surviving past the age of 5. While many factors contributed to this, poor nutrition and recurrent gastrointestinal illnesses from contaminated food and water played a major role. Young children are particularly susceptible to dehydration from diarrhea and a lack of understanding about rehydration methods meant that even a common stomach bug could quickly turn fatal. Historians still argue whether medieval parents were aware of the specific dangers of contaminated food for their children, or if they simply accepted high infant mortality as an unavoidable tragedy. A quirky tidbit: some medieval parents would give their babies a suck bag, a piece of linen tied with a bit of chewed bread or grain mixed with honey, which was then given to the baby to suck on. While intended to soothe and nourish, these bags were breeding grounds for bacteria and a source of potential botulism if the honey was contaminated. You're watching a medieval mother spooning a thin gruel into her child's mouth. The child looks pale, and you notice a fly land on the gruel before it's consumed. It's a heartbreaking scene, a stark illustration of how the very attempt to nourish a child could inadvertently expose them to the deadliest of medieval food hazards. The vulnerability of the young compounded all the other risks we've discussed, making childhood a journey fraught with unique and often insurmountable dietary dangers. You've just glimpsed the heartbreaking vulnerability of medieval children to dietary dangers. Now, let's consider a broader environmental factor that significantly amplified the risks of the medieval diet: the sickness season, warmth and woe. Today, you might associate summer with fresh produce and outdoor barbecues. In the medieval era, warmer months, far from being a time of abundance and health, often correlated directly with increased food spoilage and a terrifying surge in illness outbreaks. Imagine the arrival of summer in your medieval village. The days grow longer, the sun beats down, and while the harvest might be ripening, the very warmth that nurtures crops also acts as a relentless accelerator of decay. Without refrigeration, food spoiled at an alarming rate. Meat, milk, and fresh produce would succumb to bacterial growth far more quickly than in the cooler months. This meant that the window for safe consumption was drastically reduced, and the risk of ingesting spoiled food skyrocketed. A mainstream historical fact is that historical records frequently show a rise in diseases like dysentery, typhoid, and other forms of food poisoning during the warmer months, often referred to as summer sicknesses. The increased heat provided ideal conditions for pathogens to multiply in food, water, and waste. Coupled with the prevalence of flies and other vectors, which are more active in warm weather, the spread of contamination intensified. Historians still argue whether medieval people consciously understood the link between heat and spoilage, or if they simply observed that people got sicker in summer and adjusted their diets or practices accordingly. A quirky tidbit: some medieval texts recommended avoiding certain hot foods in summer, believing they would imbalance the body's humors further in the heat, which, while not scientifically accurate, sometimes inadvertently led to avoiding foods that spoiled quickly. You're feeling the oppressive heat of a medieval summer day. The air is heavy, and the aroma from the marketplace is a little more pungent than usual. You eye a piece of meat from the butcher's stall and notice the flies are particularly persistent today. You know from experience that your stomach is more likely to rebel after a summer meal. This wasn't just about feeling uncomfortable. It was a period of heightened risk, a predictable cycle where the very warmth of life brought with it the chilling inevitability of widespread sickness and woe. The sickness season underscored the constant, ambient threat that defined the medieval relationship with food. You've just weathered the heat of the sickness season, understanding how warmth intensified the dangers lurking in medieval food. But even if you managed to avoid visible spoilage or acute poisoning, there was another, often insidious, threat that silently plagued medieval populations: the ever-present parasites, uninvited guests. Today, you take deworming medication if necessary, and meat inspection prevents many parasitic infections. In the medieval era, parasites were an almost universal companion, silently living within bodies, causing chronic illness, malnutrition, and weakening their human hosts. Imagine that coarse medieval bread, the occasional piece of undercooked meat, the unwashed vegetables, or the cloudy water you've consumed. Each could harbor the eggs or larvae of various internal parasites. Roundworms, tapeworms, hookworms, and flukes were incredibly common. These microscopic, or sometimes macroscopic, organisms would enter your digestive system, take up residence, and slowly, silently, steal nutrients from your food, leading to chronic malnutrition even if you were eating regularly. They could cause abdominal pain, chronic diarrhea, anemia, fatigue, and other debilitating symptoms that would be dismissed as the common complaint or simply accepted as a fact of life. A mainstream historical fact is that archaeological evidence, particularly from fecal remains and mummified bodies, confirms that parasitic infections were endemic across all social classes in medieval Europe. Almost every individual harbored multiple types of parasites. This was a consequence of poor sanitation, contaminated food and water, and the close proximity of humans to animals. Historians still argue whether the cumulative burden of chronic parasitic infections significantly reduced the cognitive abilities or energy levels of medieval populations, impacting daily life and productivity. A quirky tidbit: some medieval remedies for worms involved rather unpleasant concoctions, including garlic, wormwood, or even ground glass, in attempts to expel the uninvited guests. You're feeling particularly tired today, perhaps a bit weak, despite having eaten. You might attribute it to hard labor or the oppressive summer heat, never suspecting that tiny, unseen creatures are literally siphoning away your vitality from within. The presence of parasites wasn't a one-off illness. It was a persistent, often lifelong, drain on health, a constant state of being unwell that permeated medieval existence, making every meal, no matter how carefully prepared, a potential gateway for these unseen, persistent intruders. You've reached the end of our journey through the medieval diet, having faced spoiled meats, toxic grains, and a multitude of unseen pathogens and uninvited guests. You've seen how precarious every bite could be, how common ailments were, and how fundamentally different life was without modern food safety. This brings us to echoes of the past, a modern perspective. Looking back, it's not just a historical curiosity. It's a profound reminder of how far we, in the 21st century, have come, and why we should hold a deep, often unconscious, gratitude for the safety of our food. Imagine walking into your local supermarket now. You probably don't think twice about the gleaming, refrigerated aisles, the expiration dates clearly printed on every package, the government health inspector stamps on meat. These are all products of centuries of scientific advancement, public health initiatives, and regulatory oversight born from the very struggles and miseries we've just explored. The fact that you can buy fresh chicken without fear of salmonella, or drink water straight from the tap without worrying about dysentery, is a testament to an invisible infrastructure of safety that medieval people could only dream of. A mainstream historical fact is that public health reforms, germ theory, and the advent of refrigeration technology in the 19th and 20th centuries collectively transformed food safety, drastically reducing foodborne illnesses that once decimated populations. What was once common chronic stomach ailments, parasitic infections, mysterious fevers after meals, now rare and often preventable. Historians still argue whether the psychological impact of constant food insecurity and illness in the medieval era created a more resilient, or simply more fatalistic, populace. A quirky tidbit: the common practice of toasting to your health at gatherings might have originated from medieval times, a genuine hope that the food and drink consumed wouldn't actually harm you. You're back in your comfortable bed, The gentle hum of your modern home, a soothing contrast to the creaking, damp medieval hovel. You think of that grey, slimy meat, the gritty bread, the cloudy water, and then you think of your own fridge, humming softly, filled with fresh, safe food. It's not just about convenience. It's about a freedom from fear that medieval people never knew. The echoes of their struggles remind us of the immense value of clean water, safe food handling, and the scientific understanding that protects us from those myriad dangers they faced every single day. Asterisk the distant echoes of medieval life slowly fade. Your journey through the perilous plates of the past draws to a close, and the sounds of those long ago times begin to soften, becoming merely whispers in the quiet corners of your mind. Feel the comfort of your surroundings, the secure stillness of your space. The anxieties of undercooked feasts and tainted grains are far, far away now, replaced by the gentle rhythm of your own breath. Let the imagery dissipate, like smoke from a medieval hearth, leaving behind only the calm, the lessons learned, the gratitude for modern comforts. These are yours to keep. But the fear, the hunger, the uncertainty of every meal, they belong to another time, another world. Drift now, with that comforting thought, into a deep, peaceful sleep. Sweet dreams.